Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk about a brief excerpt from the prologue of the Gospel of John about grace and truth, and how this makes Christianity unique amongst the worldviews that you find throughout the world. With a few other interesting stops along the way, and God willing, I will actually make this one relatively brief because it's relatively self-contained. So first, I'm going to read the relevant passage. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. We have beheld his glory. Glory as of the only-begotten Son from the Father. And from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now, the thing I'm going to be talking about is grace and truth, and it's sort of taking not a tangent, but a different tack that Bishop Barron did. He had a video in which he talked about the prologue of the Gospel of John in the context of Christmas, and so and what he described was how religions tend to focus either on grace or truth, but not both. That Christianity is unusual in that it actually talks about both. Now, the way he talked about grace and truth, he somewhat divided them into where grace is mercy and truth is justice. And this is a legitimate thing to do, but I'm going to go in a different direction because there's something very interesting in a different direction from this. If we take grace to be goodness and truth to be understanding, basically, and these things are not actually separable in themselves, but they are separable in human beings because human beings are capable of trusting. That is to say, we can do something that we know is good because somebody who understands has told us that it is good without us understanding that it is good. And so you can have grace without truth in that sense, in us. And by the way, when I talk about understanding and so on, I mean understanding according to the human capacity to understand. Obviously, in no context can we understand with the fullness of the creator of everything that is. So that's not what I'm talking about. It's within the confines of what it is possible for a human being to understand. Now, in that context, when we look at that, it says the law came through Moses. Now, what is the law? Well, we're very quick to tend to assume that the law is, the law is, is justice, that the law is essentially like punishments and retribution. And, and as such, we'd be tempted to associate with truth, but what is it really? Well, the purpose of the law is for you to follow the law, not to be punished for not following the law. It's not there for the punishment, it's there for getting it right. And as such, the law is a way to live. The law is a code of conduct. The law is how to be good. Understanding would be like having a map, but the law is more like having a compass and being told a direction. Follow, northeast on this compass and you will get to someplace good, even though you don't know where the heck you are. That's really what the law is. And if you look at the law, yes, there are punishments and stuff, but it's really concerned with telling you how to live, telling you what to do, to be good, to be truthful, to be honest, to be generous, to be kind, to be merciful. The law is, and in a great deal of practical ways, not just in that level of generality, but that's what the law of Moses is really about. It's telling you to be good in specifics without really explaining why these things are good very much, anyway. As I said, you'll never find goodness with no truth whatsoever. So it's not fully possible, but to a great degree it's that. And you will find the same emphasis elsewhere. And goodness without understanding. You'll find this in Islam. And there's actually essentially a philosophical dispute that happened in the medieval Muslim world that killed off Muslim philosophy between Averroes and Al-Ghazali, where Averroes held basically that there was philosophy, which was truth, and then Islam was more or less like a kid's crayon cartoon version of this for people too dumb to understand philosophy. And unfortunately for him, he put this very cleverly so only the intelligent people would understand, but unfortunately for him, Al-Ghazali was quite intelligent and understood. And massively oversimplifying, Al-Ghazali wrote The Incoherence of the Philosophers, where he more or less argued essentially that philosophy was immorality for smart people. And Averroes tried to answer him, but failed, and more or less philosophy was killed off. But you see this distinction between understanding and goodness very, very clearly here, because they were more or less at war with each other, and one side beat the other within Islam. Um, and not to say, I'm not trying to say that Islam is perfectly good or anything. I'm saying, for all of these, all of the worldviews that I am talking about, I'm talking about them within their own understanding or within their own context. Now, again, you can see this in Hinduism for common people. Because Hinduism actually bifurcates, and this bifurcation is very interesting. On the one hand, you have Dharma. You have the ordinary way that ordinary people live, with their multiplicity of gods, and they have their Dharma and what you're supposed to do and how to live a good life, and you follow your obligations and do the things that you're supposed to do, and this will more or less, according to the common understanding, be rewarded. That this is the way to leading a good life. This is the way to goodness, is to just do these things. And that's more or less the understanding. If you look at how these things tend to get taught, they tend to get taught along the lines not of first explaining, especially not explaining abstractly, but rather of telling people, just do what you're supposed to do. 20, 30 years from now, you'll start to understand why you should be doing it. And that is actually true in practice. I mean, if you lead a virtuous life, you will tend to eventually come to some measure of wisdom. It won't be all that much understanding, typically speaking, not abstract understanding especially. But articulable understanding is probably even a better way of putting it. But you will come to some, a little bit of understanding. But for the most part, it's just, here is the right way to live this way, and it's going to work out a lot better than the alternative. And to be fair, generally speaking, will. With some asterisks, which I'll come to later. And here in Hinduism, we can see started the bridge, because there's the other path in Hinduism, which is the yogis. And I'm going to be talking about sort of the ideal yogi, or the yogi of stories, rather than the actual yogis, because it illustrates the point better. And so you have the yogi who does things like stands on his big toe for years on end and eats nothing but his own drool and so on. And so that is the way, just doing nothing but meditating on the nature of reality. And this is outside of Dharma. The yogi puts himself outside of Dharma. He doesn't follow his Dharma pretty much at all, because your Dharma is not to stand on your big toe and eat nothing and just meditate forever. But, well, I'm sorry, not but so like this is, in the really extreme example, there's an interesting Hindu story of the yogi who was doing this. He's standing on his big toe for, I don't know, thousands of years or something, and doing nothing but meditating. He was starting to get so powerful through his understanding that he was starting to scare the gods, and so Shiva came and tried to tempt him with something, and he said, and I think his response, if I recall the story properly, was the guy pricked his skin, and he bled vegetable juice. And then Shiva went and pricked his skin. He bled white ash, showing that he was, that much more in tune with the universe. Something to do with the internal heat of him from all this energy and power of becoming so attuned to the universe. And so the yogi then, I don't know, fell down or something. And anyway, he was humbled because Shiva understood so much better than he did. And so here you see, again, on the one side in Hinduism, you see, through Dharma, you see that goodness without understanding, and on the other side, the yogi side, you see understanding, but not with goodness. Certainly not in goodness in the same sort of way, and not really goodness in any really externally recognizable sense, since the idea is to sort of become one with the universe. And within Hinduism, since it's pantheistic, destruction is as much a part of the world as creation, and evil as much a part as good. So in some sense, you can't really call anything evil, but from outside the system, more or less, you come to appreciate evil. So it's not really goodness in a recognizable way. Now, the next step is when you go from Hinduism to Buddhism. And what you have, and I'm going to talk about Siddhartha Gautama and Buddhism sort of as he taught it, not what it became later, because Buddhism changes fairly radically when it moves around, and later on when it's not something adopted by Hindu yogis. Because the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was a Hindu yogi, and he meditated and he didn't eat and so on, and super quickly. Eventually, he was mistaken for a wood sprite, and somebody offered him an offering of rice. He was so incredibly rail thin from never eating and so on. And it never brought him any happiness or peace or contentment or anything. And he basically said, screw it, I'm hungry. He ate it, and then he wasn't hungry and thought, like, wow, this is actually kind of nice to not, to be at peace, not hungry. And then he saw through the illusion of the world. And anyway, sort of fast forwarding a little bit, he saw the truth. He saw all of his past lives and so on, um, and he saw the truth that life is sorrow. And so, that we're strapped on the wheel of samsara, the wheel of sorrow, this eternal recurrence of, is all miserable. So, more or less, he then figured out how to get out of this thing. Because the problem was just dying doesn't do you any good, because you're going to come right back, because you're strapped to the wheel of samsara. You're in this eternal recurrence that everything just keeps on happening over and over again. And so, he wanted a way out of this, and basically, through completely understanding it, he understood it and knew how to escape the cycle of karma. Because doing actions, essentially, desire is the cause of suffering. Well, desire, acting like that, binds you in, because it binds you into cause and effect. And so through completely understanding things, you can stop desiring them. You can achieve nirvana, that is to say, extinguishment. And you can stop wanting anything. You can extricate yourself from this sort of web of causality, that binds you into this cycle of sorrow. And through understanding, you can step out of it. There's no goodness to be had. It's the whole point that life is suffering. Nothing's good. But through understanding, you can escape the suffering. You can at least extinguish yourself. You have understanding, but not goodness. Again, later Buddhisms change radically, because most people, their goal is not eternal death. But most people are not Hindu yogis who are dissatisfied with being a Hindu yogi, so it kind of makes sense. But it's very illustrative, even though there aren't many Buddhists in the mold of Siddhartha Gautama. And then we come to the more or less original Buddhistic worldview that you see a lot of today, which is modern materialism. The idea that there is nothing but matter, and everything that there is to know is summed up inside of a physics textbook, and so on. That sort of basic thing. It's not really possible to define modern materialism or naturalism or whatever you want to call it. Rebranded from materialism, but whatever. That is very much, again, understanding without goodness, knowledge without goodness. Truth without goodness. You have truth without grace. Because you have, sort of in Chesterton's world, the world is entirely understandable, but none of it's worth understanding, because it's all just these interactions of elementary particles, and it's nothing but a repetition of the sort of, there are few dreary mechanical laws that just play themselves out over and over and over again, and then just the world is all just this repeated on a truly enormous scale, but there's nothing means anything. Life has the meaning you give it. That's to say, you can pretend that it has meaning, but it, doesn't really. And I've talked about that in several videos. If you really want to see that, I think I've got a video called Life Doesn't Have the Meaning You Give It, in which I talk all about that. But it is very clearly, if you consider it at all seriously, truth without grace. It is truth without goodness. There's nothing good. You have preferences because they happen to work out for your ancestors, or just by pure chance. And that's it. That's all. There's nothing meaningful about any of it. There is no goodness. Nothing's better than anything else. It's all just configurations of subatomic particles. But you can understand how these subatomic particles all work relative to each other. There are a bunch of nice equations that describe their relationships to you. And this is probably the epitome of truth without grace. The epitome of understanding without goodness. And so that's sort of this, in some sense, it's not quite a spectrum, but you can see sort of the lay of the land. And there are lots of other things, Zoroastrianism probably falls more on the grace without truth, though it has a little bit. There's a bit of, here's, there's the war going on between the two of them, and here's how to live within it. But again, it's sort of a simple revelation, and the whole point is to sort of pick your side and tell you how to live, but it's got a bit of it. So it sort of comes closer to the middle. And for the various worldviews you see, you can put them, but they tend to cluster very much on one side or the other. Zoroastrianism, although there's an asterisk on that, because it's a revelation to one guy, and that's the sum total, during I think it was a Vedic religious ceremony. And he sort of had a vision of how things are. Sort of. So Zoroastrianism is weird, because piecing together even exactly what it is not that easy. But in any event, so you have these things, and they tend to come this way. Christianity, however, is grace and truth, and both in abundance. Christianity has both how to live, but also why to live like that. And you have in it this uniting of understanding with doing in a way that you don't really see elsewhere. And there's a reason why you find these two in Christianity but not elsewhere. And that reason is the incarnation. See, there's you'll see this just to foreshadow it. And Christ said very interestingly, I no longer call you slaves because a slave does not know what his master is doing. I call you friends because I've told you everything that I've learned from the Father. And so you might think like, okay, cool, but why couldn't people have been told before? I mean, if it's just a matter of telling people, why wait? Why not tell them back at the time of the law? I mean, and it's the incarnation. And it's the incarnation because the incarnation is an event, not just in Christ, but in humanity. The incarnation is the raising of human beings up. There's the Orthodox like to use the phrase theosis. There's the phrase that God became man, that man might become God. That in the incarnation, God raised up nature. By God taking on a human nature was elevated. Now, the thing about this is that prior to the incarnation as an actual event with significance, human beings are incomplete. We're not what we're supposed to be. And so it's not really possible to explain human beings, to explain what we're supposed to do in terms of what human beings were. That is to say, as simple fallen creatures, what we're supposed to be doing and how we're supposed to act doesn't really make sense as that sort of fallen creature. It's only as redeemed creatures that have been incorporated into God, that what we're supposed to do really truly makes sense. And this is one reason why you will see hints of the idea of something like theosis in, especially in Judaism. But you'll also see that sort of idea at least hinted at in a bunch of other worldviews, because human goodness doesn't really make sense apart from it. And so to the degree that people were straying from goodness without understanding and sort of catching glimpses of understanding, theosis is really hinted at within any sort of actually good human morality. But it's with the incarnation that it then makes sense to have grace and truth together, because you have not only grace, but grace in abundance, grace upon grace, and it is possible to understand because human beings have become, in a limited sense, I mean, individually speaking, we're not there yet. Individually, we're still being built up within time and so on, but the human species has become what it is supposed to be. Not individually, we're not, the human species not as the sum of individuals, but in terms of our shared human nature, we now know what our shared human nature really is, and our shared human nature is much better than what it looks like. We're not the cleverest of the beasts that crawl the earth, but rather we are the image of God in a really full sense, the icon of God. And so in the incarnation, it becomes possible to understand goodness, because goodness is treating things essentially according to their nature. And so it's only once we really have that nature that it becomes possible to understand how we're supposed to act. And so within Christianity, you finally have the completion, and upon the completion of the promise, upon the completion of the promise of our salvation, and this is why within Christianity we live in the end times, that history has become completed at this point, because Christ has fulfilled what was needed to be done. It is now possible to understand because things are what they're supposed to be. So this is why grace and truth is, in one sense, very uniquely Christian, and why the emphasis on grace and truth, because Christianity emphasizes both in an incredible degree, that you are supposed to understand that within Christianity, that idea of love and do as you will is very, very strong, but also do what you're supposed to do is very, very strong. You'll find Christian heresies that will emphasize one or the other, but in Orthodox Christianity, little o Orthodox Christianity, you find an incredible emphasis on the two together, to do what you're supposed to do and understand why. Don't just do the right thing, but do the right thing for the right reasons, is an extremely important facet of Christianity. And do the right thing for the right reasons is much less emphasized elsewhere, because for the most part, most people aren't expected to know what the right reasons actually are. You're just expected to know what the right thing to do is. But in Christianity, that's not good enough. You're supposed to understand why. Not instead, not as a substitute, but together with. Because finally, history being complete, we're now understandable within the limits of human reason. And so that's why grace and truth comes through Jesus Christ, because the fullness of being human beings comes through Jesus Christ. And that's what makes it possible to have truth as well as grace. And so, yeah, I unfortunately don't have a great ending for this. That's really the point. And to me, the very interesting thing, the Chesterton once put it, that people talk as if Christianity was the first to preach mercy or something, which is ridiculous. If you know any history, you know it's not. And he said, people will think me very narrow, whatever that's supposed to mean, for saying that Christianity was the first to preach Christianity. But it has a very direct bearing, because Christianity is a historical religion. Christianity is also, despite being a historical religion, an incredibly intellectual religion. It is and this is why you find so many intellectuals who become Catholic in the Western world, because it makes sense. It is the fulfillment of basically anything true you find within Christianity, and it all fits together. All truths within Orthodox Christianity actually fit together within each other. It is coherent, it makes sense. But at the same time, you can't just sit on the sidelines of life and understand it. That's not good enough. You have to actually live life, and live life well, and be good. The saint in Christianity is called to be good, and to be good is the most important thing. But to anyone who can understand, understanding is part of goodness, because we are, well, Homo sapiens, the knowing man. And so it's a really fascinating part of Christianity. Very frustrating thing you'll find a lot of cradle Catholics is they love the phrase, at least many of the ones I've met, love that phrase, both and. That you'll ask an either or question, and they'll say both. And you find that a lot, not in a logically contradictory way, though, but that within Christianity you have both theory and practice being of incredible importance. You have dogma, but also saints. You don't have an emphasis on one to the exclusion of the other. The church defends right understanding, but the church also demands excellent behavior of the same people. You can't pick and choose between the two of these things. One of these things is not really good enough. You're supposed to understand according to your ability, mind you, but no matter how uneducated, you can understand things like, the nature of love and human beings being made in the image of God, and Christ being a man, and so on. There's a lot that the simple can understand. There's a tremendous amount, in fact, that the simple can understand. And to a great degree, actually, I mean, if you actually read the Gospels, Christ is more interested in explaining things to the simple than he is in explaining them to the wise, or to the complex. Not because there's anything wrong with the complexity, but because the main truths are understandable. The most important truths are understandable even by the simple. And so, it's something fascinating that the mind and the heart in Christianity become united, because human beings finally become what they're supposed to be. And so the two actually can work in concert. So, this may not be very interesting to anyone who doesn't already understand it. I don't know. But for whatever it's worth, until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.